Well, hey there. I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. Hey, in this video, what I'd like to do is talk about the other side of leadership, namely followership. Now, the immediate question comes up, so what in the world is followership? And I've done a couple papers on this, and the definition I advanced is the study of followership is especially concerned with what constitutes ideal followers and how all followers are best encouraged to become the most effective and impactful followers they can be. So the bottom line is, we spend all this time looking at what makes a great leader, and at some point we want to turn around and say, well, what makes a great follower? And Adair has an interesting observation. He says, it's really not that followership is a part of leadership. It's that leadership is a part of followership. And having said that, there is quite a few people that really take issue with the idea of emphasizing followership, and they'll say things like, well, when you're young, you don't dream of being a follower, you dream of being a leader. And Rost says this, he says the word follower, is inconsistent with the post-industrial understanding of leadership. So there is some things. Other people just simply complain that they just hate the name. They want other words like collaborators, constituents, or whatnot. But I think the majority view is, it's a pretty accurate term. And the truth is, as Marousas points out, every leader is a follower. So you say, well, I'm a vice president, I'm not a follower. Really, you don't follow what the president says? Well, I'm a president, I'm not a follower. Really? You don't have to listen to the board of directors? I mean, everybody at some level, even though they're a leader, they are a follower. All right. So, and also, particularly with engineering and with knowledge workers and other videos, I've developed this concept that, as a leader, in today's situation where systems are so complex, there can't be any one person who understands every aspect of a project, of a system. When I started out in the 80s, that was actually still possible, and that was a great way to lead, a very comfortable way to lead. But now you have the situation where there's so much complexity, no one person can grasp it all, and so that creates a situation where leadership actually has to sort of move around. And Steck, a guy named Steck, he proposes this idea that if you're sitting in a circle with your team, imagine there's a green light and a blue light sort of over each person's head, and when the blue light is on, that person is being the leader in that moment. When the green light is on, that person's being the follower in that moment. And Steck's idea is that in the modern workplace among knowledge workers, and that would of course be engineers, is if you watch any sort of group meeting, you would see the blue light of leadership actually sort of bouncing all over the room because as each person contributes their expertise, they're having to provide leadership. Another observation from Warren Bennis is, it makes a lot of sense to talk about followers more than leaders because, at the end of the day, it's the followers who do the heavy lifting. I mean, generally speaking, it's the followers that do the work. And in fact, if you look at the literature, where there's been all these research efforts that show that good leadership, maybe accounts for 30% of some positive outcome, employee retention or, on-time performance or profitability or just whatever measurable thing you want to talk about. Of course, there's a significant correlation between leadership and that outcome. But as people are revisiting all those studies and then reconducting them in the light of followership, what they find is there's a higher correlation or a stronger correlation between good followership and those measurable outcomes than there is leadership. So there really is value in looking at followership. All right, so there's been a lot of really really insightful things written, a lot of great ideas. And one of the ones, there's a guy named Ira Shalif. He's written a book that I'll talk about in a minute, but he's been involved in a lot of the followership discussions. And he has a diagram that I think is just amazing. And so what he does is, he talks about sort of the traditional view of leadership, and it looks something like this, right? So you imagine the leader, picture a planet, and so maybe Jupiter, and then you've got all the moons orbiting around Jupiter. So in the traditional model of leadership, you have sort of these little F's here are the followers. You sort of conceptualize the followers orbiting around the leader. Now, what Shalif points out is that with the paradigm of followership, you really get a different model. So instead of the planet that we're orbiting around being, say, Jupiter, or the Jupiter as being the leader, the planet is the purpose. And so what you have in the followership model is you have the followers and the leader both orbiting around the purpose or the mission of the organization. And so there really is a significant mind frame switch where you're realizing that, yeah, leadership is a role, but it's not sort of the role, and especially as engineers, right? I mean, you can have all the managers you want, but if you don't have engineers doing the work, you accomplish absolutely nothing. And so followership is a little more in line with that, sort of realization. So the idea of followership was first advanced by Robert Kelly in 1992. He has an important book. And what he did is he said, there's two dimensions of followership. And so what it is the first dimension is engagement. And so that's the degree to which the employee is engaged. And engagement, it kind of means like you care, you're sort of all in. I mean, what engagement means. And if you're like me, you've had jobs where you really are engaged and you're all in and you're just kind of excited about it. And then you've also had jobs where you just kind of show up, and it's just there's not a lot of internal motivation. It's just you show up because you have to, and you understand intuitively in those two different situations how disproportionate your contribution is. I mean, it's the engaged employees that make the much greater contributions. The other dimension of followership is the extent to which the employee thinks critically for himself. And now that's an interesting thing for some leaders, because some leaders kind of like to micromanage and do all the thinking for themselves. And I've addressed that in other videos. But, Kelly's notion is the best employees are the ones that think critically for themselves. And here, when I say think critically, I don't mean like they're all critical, like, oh, you didn't do that right. You know what I mean? I mean critical in the sense of, just being critical thinker, being able to really analyze things. It's simply thinking for yourself. And so the interesting thing is having these employees who score high in both dimensions, in some ways it can be a little bit more difficult to lead. And that all has to do with, if that blue and green light is all switching around, that can be uncomfortable for the manager if they want to feel like they're always in charge. As well, with technology, with complexity, you're going to have to be sharing that leadership. And I remember seeing an interview with Bill Belichick one time where he was saying, his favorite coach, player he's ever coached is Tom Brady, but he also says the most difficult employee or player he's ever coached is Tom Brady. And, it wasn't because he's disrespectful or anything like that. He just said, Brady's so good, and with most players you can say, hey, I just watched 30 hours of game tape, and this is the tendency I think I see. And what Belichick said is, with Brady, the realization is, well, yeah, Belichick just watched 30 hours of tape, but Brady just watched 40 hours of tape, and so he has to interact with Brady at a much different level because Brady is so engaged, he thinks for himself, and of course he's the greatest of all time. Now that's important to note. So we know he's the greatest of all time, and as he follows his coach, those are the things he does. All right, so Kelly also then proposed that there's really 5 kinds of followers then, and now, of course, as an engineer, you're like, wait a minute, there's 2 dimensions. Shouldn't there be 4 kinds of four groups. And well, hear me out. Let's look at what Kelly says, and that should become apparent. So the first one is you have your sheep. And the idea of sheep is they're passive. They're not engaged. They're not thinking for themselves. They're just kind of there, and they're kind of doing the minimum and doing what they have to do. And the next one Kelly would say is you have your yes people, that just always want to say yes. So they're on the leader's side. So they're engaged in a sense. They're just whatever the leader says, I'm in. The problem with yes people is they don't think for themselves. They're just kind of letting, just deferring to the leader's thoughts. Now, the third category Kelly talks about is alienated. And so there's the idea there is that they are thinking for themselves. They are really thinking things through and having their own thoughts and thinking critically, but they've got sort of this negative energy, meaning, they're really sort of the opposite of engaged. They're just kind of pissed off. And, I've certainly worked with a number of those people, and, it's just kind of a drain on the organization. So, the yes people are just, high on engagement, low on thinking, and alienated is, sort of the opposite. They're high in thinking but low in engagement. And then here's, the fourth category. That's the one that messes up the, why aren't there four, is the pragmatics. And what Kelly means when he talks about pragmatics, he describes people that, they're just kind of in the middle on everything. And what they do is it's not about whether they are or aren't engaged, whether isn't really whether they are thinking or not. They're sort of on the fence, and they're sort of opportunistic and sort of coming at it from a perspective of what's best for me. And, sort of at some level, I guess, shallow, and at some level just sort of lazy. And they will from time to time appear to be engaged, and from time to time appear to think for themselves, but they're just sort of being blown about by the wind. And then Kelly's fifth group is the star followers. And the idea there is these are people who are engaged and who think for themselves. And, these are the employees that you want. These are the employees that will make the most difference in the organization. And these can be more difficult to manage just because, what happens when you have these kind of employees, you discover that, and, there are things they're better at than you. You really, your humility, you have to, your ego takes a little bit of a hit, when you realize that, wow, in a lot of cases their value is greater than your own. And, you have to kind of get over it. That's just the nature of it. You want to succeed in technology, and the truth is you have to have very, very strong technical experts. Now, Ira Shalif had another one too, and another way to think about this. Maybe this is from that last model from Kelly was kind of like, if you think about it from the perspective of the employee, what will that look like? The employee will be engaged, and the employee will think for himself. But if you think about it from the perspective almost of how it looks from the manager's perspective, what Shalif does is he has two axes, and on the y-axis, it's this issue of support. To what extent does the manager feel supported by the employee? And that's on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, it's to what extent does the manager feel challenged, like the employee pushes him to, work harder or study more or understand it better. And I don't mean challenge like, pain in the butt kind of challenge, but it's more of like iron sharpens iron challenge. At any rate, so Shalif, what he's got is in quadrant 4 there, low challenge, low support. The idea is just an employee who's kind of there, you ask them to do something, they're an expert on this particular thing. You ask them to do it, and they'll do it. And maybe they're not even particularly the best at it, but they'll do it. And so just kind of one of the gang. Now the next one is individualist, and the idea there is that it's again sort of low support, unengaged. But at least their expertise is unquestioned, and so there is an element of challenge in that it does kind of push the manager, to work harder and be better. The next quadrant is implementer, and the idea there is it is somebody who really is supporting employee or the manager rather, they're really wanting to do their best, wanting to push the leader. But maybe they don't quite have the skills, or they're quite able or experienced or whatnot. So they're supporting, but they're not challenging. And then finally, you have your partner, and that's really what you want, is the employee who supports the leader and also challenges them, and kind of iron sharpens irons and motivates them to do better. Let's see. One final thing is Melissa Karsten and some of her colleagues did an interesting paper in 2010, and she had another way to sort of categorize followers. And she said, there's the passive follower, there's the active follower, and there's the proactive follower. And her concept was, the passive follower is the one who's just kind of trying to do the minimum, and the active is taking their work seriously. They're really working hard, but there's just some level in which they're not all in, and the proactives are the one who are doing everything they're asked and kind of asking, what else can I do? How else can I help you? Any rate, so for further reading, there's 3 books here. Robert Kelly, he kind of kicked this whole thing off. Ira Shalif, I just mentioned a lot of his things there. And then there's a great book by Ron Riggio, Ira Shalif, and Jean Lippman-Blumen. It's actually a collection of papers by a whole bunch of folks, and that one's probably the best one to read. A lot of those people I mentioned at the beginning are all chapters out of that book. But the Shalif one is very, very readable, great book to get. The Riggio one is also pretty readable, and it has an amazing collection of scholarship. The Kelly one kicked it off, a lot of good stuff in there. Kelly has a chapter in the Riggio one. The Kelly one's just a little bit older. It's a lot more things that have been learned since then, but it's interesting to read just from sort of a historical perspective. At any rate, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich. You can find more of my videos at tomulrichconsulting.com. If you're on YouTube, you can search on Dr. Tom Ulrich. And if you don't mind, if you can subscribe and or do a little like, if you want to write a comment, I'll comment back. The whole deal is that YouTube will recommend me more to other people as I get more subscribers and more likes and so on. At any rate, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I'm the Engineering Leadership Guy, and we'll talk to you later.